Welcome to the Reason Roundtable, your weekly cry for help from the magazine of free minds and free markets. I am Matt Welch, joined by Peter Suderman, Nick Gillespie, and returning special guest star, Elizabeth Nolan Brown. Please clap, everyone, and hi.
Hi, Matt.
Hi, Matt.
Happy Monday.
That's right. We're going to dive right into the national muck here in a moment. But first, a word from our sponsors over at St. John's College. Friends, do you know who's welcome at St. John's College? Everyone is welcome. From America's founding fathers to the Greek philosophers who are the wellspring of democratic ideals to contemporary critics who question everything. At St. John's College, students encounter Adam Smith and Karl Marx, St. Augustine and Friedrich Nietzsche. How did I do, Nick? Is that a good pronunciation? James Baldwin and Virginia Woolf. Here, there are no secondary sources, no experts, and no one telling you what to believe, period. Rather, it's original sources and a community devoted to collaborative inquiry, intellectual humility, and the discomfort that comes from encountering diverse opinions. Explore 3,000 years of human thought on campuses in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Annapolis, Maryland. For master's degree candidates, St. John's College offers studies in the great texts of the East, in person or online. Learn more at SJC.edu/reason. That's SJC.edu/reason. Go there today. You'll be glad you did. All right. You might think, what with the escalating wars and the, political assassination attempts and the looming budget standoff on Capitol Hill, that there might be too much actual news to make room for a bunch of tawdry porn gossip and lurid sex crime investigations in the national conversation. And yet, here we are, and here, perhaps, given trends in technology and politics and law enforcement, we might be for a while. Liz, I swear to God, we're not typecasting you here. But you are the preeminent libertarian journalist who covers the modern day war on vice. So I'm interested particularly in the national implications of the indictment unveiled last week against rap mogul Sean Combs, variously known as P. Diddy and other aliases. Correct anything I'm getting wrong here. He reportedly had huge sex parties at his mansion called freak-offs. It's very important, in which he'd bring in male prostitutes, and then his guests would have a bunch of sex and maybe some drugs, and there would be filming. And we do know that he in particular, although I don't know if it's part of the indictment, has a history of being accused by women of beating them up. Pretty ugly stuff. It all sounds perfectly appalling to my Victorian ears. But why exactly is this a federal case as opposed to something that the local vice squad might investigate? And why should those of us who are not invited to freak-offs care whether the feds are involved or not?
Yeah, so it's one of those things where if there are any crimes here, if there was abuse of these women, like physical abuse of these women, if there was sexual assault that happened, if there was, prostitution, which, obviously is still a crime, even though it shouldn't be, going on, these would be local or state offenses. And it seems like, they could easily be taken care of at the local or state level. The feds got involved, though, for a couple of reasons. One, because there's a Mann Act violation. Mann Act, the old Victorian law that says you can't bring people across state lines for immoral purposes like prostitution. So there's a Mann Act charge in there. And then they've also tried to get him for sex trafficking and conspiracy because they, it kind of is really interesting. It turns the traditional sex trafficking sort of case on its head. Traditionally, you'd say the trafficker is the person who forces someone into sex work and then collects the money. In this case, it's alleging that, Combs paid money to sex workers who were totally consenting, but that he forced or coerced the women that they were having sex with into it. It kind of lists some ways that he coerced them that may be legitimate. It kind of lists some that seem pretty dubious, like they took drugs, and it doesn't say that he drugged them. It just says, that there was drugs, but that he gave them drugs to make them compliant. It says, like he told them that he wouldn't help their careers if they didn't participate. These are things that, someone that is a grown adult could agree to or not agree to, but they don't seem, like they should warrant a sex trafficking charge. And he's also saying that, some of the staff that he worked with, they rented hotel rooms for these parties sometimes. They brought in all sorts of supplies like lube and like drugs and like all sorts of things. And therefore, they are in on this conspiracy, this racketeering conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. So that's the other sort of interesting thing here is they're using that to go after all of his businesses, like Combs Enterprises and Bad Boy Records and all of these very profitable and large and long-standing businesses that he has, because they're saying that the whole organization was part of the conspiracy. So I think we kind of have an answer there as to why this is being brought as it is instead of as a, just local sort of crime case, because doing that allows them to go after all of the assets that exist, not just from Combs himself, but for all of his, business empire.
Is there, Diddy is not far from where I'm sitting here in Brooklyn. I think he's being held on suicide watch without bail. Seems pretty serious. Is there, Elizabeth, some kind of task force within the FBI that is like pointing itself towards sex trafficking? Is there like a funded like division within the federal apparatus to go after this stuff?
There is one, but usually that's targeting sex trafficking involving minors, I think. There's this Crimes Against Children's task force. I think this is just brought by the Civil Rights Division, which concerns itself with this. I really think that the whole division wants in on saying that things are sex trafficking cases, because like, again, this is the latest in a long line of cases where it's like, I'm not saying that there wasn't maybe some underlying, abhorrent or criminal behavior going on, but it doesn't fit in the pattern of what sex trafficking laws were intended to go after, what most people think of as sex trafficking. And yet you have it sort of being, slotted into this sex trafficking case for seemingly no reason other than sort of opportunism, either in terms of getting assets or getting attention. And you have these just like absurd statements, like the federal prosecutor said in court, like freak-offs are inherently harmful. And you're just like, I mean, why? Like sex parties are inherently harmful, so that's like the FBI's business. I mean, it's again, like there might be underlying criminal activity here, but the way that they're going about it seems like they're really just trying to like confuse everyone with all these lurid details so that they don't pay too much attention to the fact that like the case itself for sex trafficking seems really weak so far.
If freak-offs are inherently harmful, then I'm very worried that everyone on this podcast is going to be charged.
I don't think so. Nick, I'm old enough to remember when our friend and sometime donor to the Reason Foundation, John Staliano, was rung up on obscenity charges in the District of Columbia and faced life in prison. This is sort of the tail end of the George W. Bush administration's war on obscenity, and that was thrown out because it was a horrible case. And then that all kind of petered out. They did get some convictions, as I recall, Greg Beato writing about in our pages, but that sort of went away. Do you think sex trafficking has kind of become the new obscenity on some level, only this time with more kind of bipartisan enthusiasm towards enforcing it?
Yeah, I think so. And Liz obviously has written a lot about this, also as sex trafficking as the new war on drugs. Sex trafficking is broad enough to cover so many different crimes, and it's lurid. People like to read about celebrity sex stuff. I don't doubt that Diddy, along with many other people in the record business and the movie business, are oftentimes contemptible and possibly criminal actors when it comes to certain types of activities. But the idea of, bringing the federal government to bear on stuff like this is overreach, and you wonder what the hell they're doing. Like, are there no other crimes that the federal government alone should be handling that they're getting into this kind of stuff? And again, it's a way of showing that you're useful, and talking about sex trafficking is much more 21st century than obscenity, which seems, 19th century or maybe 20th century at that. I would also recommend people, we've written about it at various points over the years at Reason, but elsewhere, to look into the Mann Act, because that, along with the kind of federal drug laws that started to get passed in the progressive era in the early 20th century, are obscenely racist in their origins and intent. There was this moment in the early 19th century as fears about immigrants, particularly people who drank wine at religious ceremonies, Jews and Catholics, and spoke to their odd gods in foreign and secret languages. People were moving into cities. There was, these overlapping fears of racial mixing, of religious or theological mixing, and of magic, and of people becoming anonymous, and people being able to reinvent themselves. All of these things overlapped into what we can now see are the war on drugs, the war on vice, or on sex trafficking. And even the war on business in many ways, because there were fears of kind of Jewish bankers and chain stores that would often get linked to department stores emanating out of New York City that were suspiciously Jewish in origin. We're back to one of these moments in America where a kind of subconscious nativism is actually animating a lot of, social anxiety in a time of kind of, clearly we're going through some sort of transformation. A lot of people have anxiety about the political environment, about the economic environment. And it's good to go back and look at all of those tensions in the early 20th century and how they led to obviously bizarre and fucked up laws that should never have been passed.
Peter, Kamala Harris at the Democratic Convention bragged about her work in prosecuting Backpage, the online classified ads company that emanated from the New Times newspaper chain, and which has led to the conviction and sentencing of Mike Lacey, as well as a couple of other defendants. Can you talk a little bit about how sex trafficking has translated, or the sort of concern over it, hysteria, if that's where we're going with it, has translated or contributed to Washington's, Capitol Hill's approach towards technology and technology law and regulation?
Yeah, that's a good way of framing it. I think basically sex trafficking is the all-purpose excuse to go after something that you don't like at this point. Because as Liz has pointed out, like the law there is sort of remarkably broad, and it kind of theoretic, like it's vague in certain ways, and you can kind of apply it to a bunch of things. And because it has this incredibly incendiary insinuation attached to it. Sometimes it's not just an insinuation. Sometimes, as in at least one of the trials against the Backpage founders, or one of them, sometimes it's made explicit where the people who are throwing these sex trafficking charges around, or allegations of sex trafficking, often they are allegations but not actual charges on the books. They often want you to think that whoever they're talking about is taking children, often young underage girls, and effectively raping them or renting them out to be raped. That is the insinuation. And that is not what is happening in virtually all of these cases. So this idea is that sex trafficking, they plant that there because people hear that and they think, oh my goodness, these are child sex slavers. And in many cases, it is something more like what we are seeing in the Diddy indictment, where the sex trafficking charge stems from the fact that he stems from the allegation that he has helped pay for transportation over state lines of male prostitutes, and it's just a very different thing, but it sounds much scarier, much more unpleasant, much sort of more. It changes and charges the discussion when you call it sex trafficking, and when you say this person is a sex trafficker, and it allows you to say, well, this is every of these technologies, Backpage, whatever it is, online classifieds, Facebook. It allows you to also say those are tools of sex trafficking, right? Which again connects whatever it is to the idea of child sex slavery, which is not actually what, even when you sort of read through the indictments, what is actually being charged in virtually all of these cases.
Can I just jump into and say that, I think part of this, the reason they do this too, is because these laws were sold as this thing we needed to do to stop this epidemic that was happening. And I'm not saying that it doesn't happen where individuals are coercing other individuals into the sex trade, or conversing, one or two people into, that's the kind of cases I actually see happening. Those are not federal cases, but since there's not this epidemic actually of these giant sex trafficking rings, like people made it sound like for years, in order to justify all these, new laws and these new policing powers and this money that's thrown at it. They have to bring cases like the Diddy one and like some of these others that they've brought, because otherwise they've got nothing. Like the feds have nothing if they don't bring cases like this. They need to show that they've gotten some sex trafficking prosecutions. And I think that this is kind of why, an underlying reason why that happens too.
We should also just add really briefly that, like, it probably sounds to some listeners like we are splitting hairs here, like we are nitpicking, like, look, who cares what the charge is exactly? Because it does, it at least sounds like it is a distinct possibility that Diddy has done some really awful stuff. Like that he is a bad guy who is engaged in acts that are and should be criminal. But justice demands precision. Justice demands a kind of fairness and neutrality and a procedural consistency that it seems like is not evident in this case. And you can't just say, well, this person did something bad, it doesn't matter what we charged them with. In fact, if you want to have a justice system that stands up to scrutiny and that delivers actual justice and that can retain the trust of the public, then it needs to apply charges correctly, judiciously, and with a kind of with real caution and precision. That doesn't seem to be the case here.
And also with, extra powers and a kind of public sentiment saying, go out and get him, lock him up, throw the book at him. That's what I hear a lot. Then comes examples of specific injustices against people who shouldn't be maybe charged at all, or certainly thrown in jail for as long as they are. Liz, before we pivot, can you point to any case that you would like that, in which there's an injustice that happened as a result of this kind of legal enforcement overemphasis?
I mean, there are so many, but obviously right now the big one that happened recently is the Backpage case, where Michael Lacey, the founder of Backpage, was just sentenced to 5 years in prison, just turned himself in the week before last to go start serving his sentence. And he was not charged with sex trafficking. He's charged with facilitating prostitution and ended up convicted of one money laundering count. But there was this whole taint of people saying sex trafficking during this investigation, as Peter pointed out. And I think that contributed to a lot of the hesitation by anyone in the press and, in the civil liberties community and people that normally would sort of defend against this sort of ridiculous federal overreach that we saw and these free speech incursions that we saw in this case, sort of not wanting to get involved because people sort of, just kept saying it was about sex trafficking.
Let's move on to Mark Robinson, a name I didn't know until 2 weeks ago, and I was happier then, I guess. He's the North Carolina lieutenant governor and Republican gubernatorial candidate, who, as CNN uncovered last week, just as the campaign filing deadline was coming up, they've found that, quote, he made a series of inflammatory comments on a pornography website's message board more than a decade ago, in which he referred to himself as a black Nazi and expressed support for reinstating slavery. Also, quote, despite a recent history of anti-transgender rhetoric, Robinson said he enjoyed watching transgender pornography. End quote. These comments were allegedly, keep it together, Nick, these comments were allegedly made between 2008 and 2012 on a website called Nude Africa. The CNN News came a couple of weeks after a website called The Assembly reported that Robinson had been a frequent customer of a porn shop in the 1990s and aughts. Robinson denied making the Nude Africa comments, including one reference, at least, to Martin Luther King as Martin Lucifer Coon, and said they were made up, although CNN was pretty convincing in pinning his digital footprint on all of this. He's had mass resignations on his campaign staff. He's trailing the Democratic nominee, Josh Stein, by about 8 percentage points. And this is North Carolina, people. It's a critical swing state, so this might somehow have an impact on the national election. Nick, real talk, should we or North Carolinians care about
I believe in a
this?
clothed Africa policy, Matt. Please, clothed Africa.
Wow. Kink shaming, lifestyle shaming. No, should we care about this?
No, I'm not.
Thanks, John Ashcroft.
First and foremost, the CNN story does seem pretty well researched. It's important to note that Robinson flatly denies all of this. his actual policies and his rise to office, you don't even have to dig into, I love the idea of a politician being attacked for hypocrisy because he doesn't want transsexuals in Target bathrooms, but he likes watching tranny porn. Like, wow, that's the ultimate gotcha, right? I am glad to be alive to be in this moment in history, but none of that even matters. He is, he came to prominence. He did a bunch of YouTube rants at city council meetings over, and it seems like a million years ago, about when North Carolina started pushing laws banning businesses from allowing them, them to pick what bathrooms people used in their stores, which is, from a conservative point of view, you would think they don't want the government getting into people's bathrooms, unless that's a subreddit of Naked Africa or whatever. I don't know. But he, at various points on a Facebook post under his own name, he called the Holocaust hogwash, and he identified Jewish bankers, Muslims, China, and the CIA as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So is this the guy that you want as governor? He said last fall, there is no separation of church and state. He's also an election denier. He doesn't have policies beyond kind of culture war inflammation points. So I do think, I think he sounds like a terrible candidate. North Carolina has not elected a Republican to governor since 1993. So there's nothing new there. He's trailing badly. But I do think, Matt, that if this stuff is true, yeah, it does reflect on a candidate. If he has not, somebody mentioned St. Augustine in an ad earlier. Augustine confessed to his sins and said, I changed. Mark Robinson has published a book, a memoir, where he said he converted to Christianity. He didn't give up porn immediately, all of that kind of stuff. He hasn't made a full accounting of either his current positions, which I think are risible, or his past, which seems to conflict very much with his current stated position. So, I think it's worth thinking about, Matt.
Peter, is this an indication of, as I have seen several commenters argue, that the modern Republican Party, especially though not necessarily only in the Trump era, has a talent problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Republican primaries are the real freak-offs here, right? This is it's just, the Republicans, look, the Republicans are looking for candidates who are transgressive. That's what Mark Robinson has delivered, is transgression after transgression after transgression, right? And so, like, if it were just some weird porn stuff in his background, that would definitely not be a big deal. I mean, it might make headlines, but it just wouldn't be a big deal. It wouldn't be the sort of thing that you'd say, well, this person should be disqualified. But then you add in, well, the black Nazi, the praising Hitler, the talking about how great slavery was, and you put that in context with all the other stuff that he has said in public, which dabbling in anti-Semitism, saying, well, our enemies need to be killed, and kind of walking right up to the line of suggesting, that maybe that just means like a bunch of liberals, right? Like, and this is the problem right now with the Republican Party, is that under Donald Trump, and since Donald Trump became the nominee, it really seems like there is, maybe not the entire Republican Party, but a significant faction of the right, of the GOP, that is just it's not even, how do I say this, right? Like, they don't care if he has any policies. They don't care if he has any substance. They actually like him because he is a deranged, shouty wacko. That's the point of it, and that's the point of a candidate like him. And from our perspective, like, that's terrible. That's not a good way to pick candidates. But the Republicans, the Republican Party, at least in the primaries, seem to be increasingly picking people in this mold. Mark Robinson, I think, really shows the kind of the derangement of at least a segment of the Republican primary electorate.
And he was given a privileged spot of speaking at the Republican National Convention himself. Liz, is this like the future, or maybe the present, of Oppo research at this point, where we just go dumpster diving through not just people's social media, but we find where they think they're being private, the places that always get leaked, like old porn sites or hookup sites, or Ashley Madison, which is, I think, back in the news, that particular leak. Sort of walk us through both the possibilities and kind of your sense of the ethics or just whatever of it.
Well, first of all, like, I just want to know why these sorts of comments came up on a pornography forum. Like, what prompted him to share this, like, I'm a black Nazi kind of thing? Like, I first read that and I thought, like, okay, this is some, like, weird sort of kink role-playing thing. But then you read the thing and in context, it just seems like he just was like, nope, I'm just volunteering this information for, like, absolutely no reason. So I find that fascinating how this stuff came up in the first place.
It's pillow talk. You get intimate.
Yeah. But of course, this is going to be increasingly likely to happen. We've seen, some of this much less severe stuff with JD Vance, our first millennial candidate on a major presidential ticket, and people digging up his old LiveJournal comments and things like that. I think for the next, I don't know how long, but for the next foreseeable future, we're going to be going through a huge, wave of this sorts of stuff because none of us were thinking about this sort of stuff in 2003, 2004, even 2008. I think people had much more of a sense that, maybe you knew not to like post some stuff under your, public full name account, but people didn't have as much sense of how everything was tied together and how everything would be, findable in time. I think maybe eventually it'll start to like, fizzle out because people will get wiser people have gotten wiser about this stuff like now and even in the past 5-10 years, but going back to the aughts, people didn't have as much of a sense of worry about the footprint that they were leaving online whatsoever.
I think it's important to recognize how far we've come in not giving a shit about candidates' personal lives, Matt. And if you go back to the 60s when people like Nelson Rockefeller, was considered irradiated by the fact that he had been divorced, that type of thing. We don't really care. For the most part, most people don't care about the personal, paths of people unless they are, unbelievably hypocritical or just noxious. I don't think, for instance, with JD Vance, the pictures of him in makeup and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That hasn't stuck. Nobody cares. He was young, whatever. Nobody even cares about his youthful LiveJournal stuff. What they're talking about is who he is now. And then when you go back and you see the flip-flops or the changes, yeah, people care about that. But I think it's in this larger service of, is a candidate who they say they are, and are these beliefs real, or are they just situational ethics in order to get ahead? I think with Mark Robinson, who is in the long line of black Republicans, right? Republicans, the Republican Party loves to talk about how they're the party of Lincoln, and then they are, the party of Herman Cain and of Alan Keyes and of Ben Carson and people like that. And he's a bad candidate from a Republican point of view. He's losing by 10 points. He is, he claims to be a conservative, which means he is going for the evangelical vote, which is something like 35% in North Carolina. And he's saying there is no such thing as a separation of church and state. From a libertarian point of view, that kind of puts my hair on end. But mostly what it suggests to me is like, this guy is not the type of person that you want running. And then when you go back and you find that he did a lot of sinning by his account, I could give two shits about what he rented. But I think it's relevant.
Robinson preferred Herman Cain's 999 plan in the original German.
Ben Carson might be a bad politician, at least from my point of view, but the man's hands are gifted. Nick, let's not.
I guess so. We don't he should have been surrounded by children that he saved, because he also looks like what was that guy on Saturday Night Live, Jim, the guy who always looks stoned. Herman Cain is like, in every interview I've ever seen him, it's like he's channeling an ancient spirit,
Nothing wrong with that. All right. We're going to get to our listener question of the week here in a moment. But first, a word from our sponsors over at the University of Chicago. Friends, in an election year, it's all too easy to get submerged in the flood of news and opinions. Understanding the real-life impact of political events can be tough in the autumn of an even-numbered year. So have we got a podcast for you, Not Another Politics Podcast. brought to you by the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Not Another Politics podcast provides clear, research-driven perspectives on the biggest issues of the day. Get the insights you truly need to understand the political landscape. No spin, just facts. Subscribe today at harris.uchicago.edu/NAPP. That's harris.uchicago.edu/NAPP, or just look for Not Another Politics podcast wherever you acquire your podcasts. Do it today. You'll be glad you did. All right, reminder, email your brief queries to roundtable@reason.com. This one comes from Jay Hickey. Did I go to college with you, Jay Hickey? Sounds familiar. Who writes, when thinking about why you're a libertarian, and also thinking about how you make a case to others for libertarianism, how important is its efficacy versus its principles? I do think libertarianism principles would provide better results, but even if they didn't, I wouldn't give a shit, because those principles are right. I'm sure I would like the results, but I'm here for the liberty and autonomy. Let the chips fall where they may. P.S., says Jay Hickey, I'm ready to be the first in line when the Reason store starts selling the "Where were you when we were getting bile" coffee mugs. Jay, someday you will find these. Nick, that is the eternal question, right? The principles versus efficiency. What vote you?
I think if we got a fully libertarian world and it was disastrous, it would probably be time to rethink your 100% or 110% commitment to principle. The idea behind most political philosophy is not that you are right in some kind of metaphysical way, but rather that it is a way to a better world. So I appreciate Jay Hickey's question and the amount of dope that he was probably smoking when he managed to type this question up. But in the end, the effects matter. I'm also not an ANCAP, so, an absolute commitment to principle, which somehow is based on the idea that it will lead to human flourishing. And then if it doesn't, it's like, well, I didn't care about human flourishing anyway. To be honest, it leaves me cold.
Wow, squish. Elizabeth Nolan Brown, what say you?
Yeah, I was just saying I'm also a squish. I think, obviously when you're talking to people and trying to sell them on libertarianism, you've got to go with the actual way it's going to play out in the real world. Like, otherwise people just, write you off. But I also think that, like, personally, I think that, the case for freedom is a moral one, but I think that it's completely intertwined with the effects that I think it has. Like, I don't think I can separate my idea that, like, this is the correct from a moral standpoint and that this would have the best effects. I don't think, one is like has more primacy than the other. I think there's, like, completely intertwined in a way that you can't actually separate.
It's also, how do you define best, right? Because the data set is never going to be super clear. I think we all agree, and I think we can show if you reduce the cost of building housing, there will be more housing and prices will generally be lower. But to say I'm going to flip a switch and, everybody gets a submachine gun, and, I would predict actually that there would not be much change in gun violence. But, people will argue about what happens as a result of a specific policy.
Peter, how do you answer the question?
It depends on the forum and the audience, which I'm going to emphasize. And I think both are important. I think Liz is totally right that the ideological, kind of principled aspect of libertarianism is totally entwined with the results aspect. But what I'm going to emphasize when I talk to different people is going to depend on that group. And in particular, for less ideological people, for people who are less politically aligned or interested, and who just want to want better lives and maybe don't want to care about this stuff all the time and think about it and occupy their brain space and, like, learn what was on, page 247 of some old Milton Friedman book, right? Like, I'm going to just talk about, like, this will make your life better and here's how. But once you've got people, like, accepting some of those claims that some of these specific policies narrowly will make your life better, if you can get them to accept a few of them, then that's a pattern. That's a way in to say, hey, maybe there's something underneath this, a bigger idea that connects all of these effects, and maybe you should start applying that to other places rather than just the narrow set of things that you care about. And so typically the way I think about this is that the less ideological, the less politically sort of invested you are, the more you want to talk about effects and results and just sort of practical day-to-day stuff. And then you want to bring people in by showing them that this isn't just a bunch of sort of scattered random ideas. You say there is something that connects all of this here, and it is in fact also something that is deeply American and something that you like and that almost all of us think of as a fundamental good, which is individual freedom.
Yeah, it's the default is freedom in liberal political philosophy, and any use of force needs to overcome a massive presumption. To the Kamala fans out there, I want to say that the liberal vision, the libertarian vision, is filled with joy.
I would add to that, and I'm in many ways probably the squishiest of the squishes assembled on this panel. I would also add, though, that
Matt, you're like that. Sorry.
You chose wisely, sir. That moments in which you kind of let the moral case stop laughing, please. I'm talking. Let the moral case fly. Can be some of the most effective. I mean, there's been a couple of record scratch moments on television or wherever when you talk about stuff in the drug war, prostitution, or just the government telling businesses what to do, and you get your spittle-flecked dudgeon on, and sometimes you get people's attention a little bit more. It's fun, actually, to do that too. So I think part of the balance that we play in this world is that most people live in the, hey, I want a better outcome. And so you want to talk to people where they live. But as part of that too, there is something inherently ideological about pragmatic problem solving that pretends to not be ideological. I know that's kind of a weird pretzel, but it's also true. The instinct to do something, and it doesn't matter what it is, when there's a crisis, has led to some of the worst policies. And so to overly default to the, hey, I'm just pragmatic like you, just trying to solve the problem, sometimes gives too much to people who actually don't care whether the applied policies will solve the problem. They just want there to be a show of government do-somethingism or a force to solve the problem. Many disasters have laid in that direction.
Matt, what's your best spittle-flecked invocation of deontological libertarianism?
I think there was a time that I went and I had my COVID hair on, and I went on Morning with Bill Schultz and Joanne Nosochinsky, and I think I was like, we're going to bring heroin into your elementary schools kind of thing, but also just screaming at everyone who for all the decades were saying that it was like, fundamentally unserious for libertarians to, and this is by everyone, I mean every Democrat and every Republican, to want to legalize marijuana, for example. Like the people who in California, when they were first looking at Proposition, I've already forgotten, like 19, right? Where they did the recreational legalization that failed in 2012, I believe it was. Everybody was like, all the editorial boards were like, what are they smoking? And Arnold Schwarzenegger, who it's not hard to find pictures of him sucking down a joint.
Yeah, at the end of Pumping Iron, he fucking smokes a joint.
Triumphant. He was like, oh, if we do this, we'll be a laughing stock. Like, no, fuck all you people. Sorry for that, Fred Young. I didn't mean that. See, you're getting me all hot and bothered.
Yeah, no, that the star of Jingle All the Way is worried about public opinion.
I mean, that movie has corrupted a lot of souls. All right, we have to carry briskly along here. As semi-teased at the top of the show, we are having another one of those half-hearted, hey, we're going to have a government shutdown, maybe, I swear, moments on Capitol Hill, with the various kabukis and continuing resolutions, and setting up for the annual week of Let's Pretend to Legislate in December. Peter, can you quickly walk through what's happening, what is pretending to be happening, what will happen, and what should happen?
Yeah, so you guys know how there's this thing called the fiscal year? Well, it happens every single year. Right? It's kind of amazing, right? Just like, it's very predictable, actually. Just like the tides and the moon and the calendar changing. It happens every year. And for the last 25 plus years, the Congress has not gotten it together to pass all 12 appropriations bills in order to, which is the sort of the discretionary funding for the government by that fiscal year. So a lot of what has happened is that instead of passing a 12 appropriations bills as called for by the 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act, like what they've done instead is they have passed either a CR, which is a continuing resolution, which is basically we're going to continue funding at current levels for some temporary period of time, or an omnibus, which is we're just going to roll all these things together into one big mega bill, or in some cases, my favorite, we get a cromnibus, which is a CR combined with an omnibus. And frequently this happens at the end of the calendar year, so around Christmas time or New Year's, because even though the fiscal year actually ends at the end of September, they almost always punt this down the road until the end of the calendar year. And that's what it looks like is going to happen in the next week or so, is if they don't pass something, the government will have one of those shutdowns, and I'm putting that in air quotes because in fact most things won't shut down, but the government's not going to shut down because they're going to pass what looks like about a 3-month continuing resolution, keep the government open basically right until Christmas, at which point they will have the annual do your job, have a budget week like they have every year. It's amazing. It's just amazing. They can't do this despite the fact that we know it's coming every year, and despite the fact that the Republicans in the House ousted the last speaker over his failure to get this done and promised that this time would be different. It's not different. We're going to do a CR again.
Just want to shout out and point for people's viewing pleasure. Thomas Massey, Republican congressman, he gave a speech, I believe it was last week, maybe even the week before, saying, we're doing this all again. I'm not participating in this theater. This is garbage. And he was talking to his fellow Republicans about what they were doing. And he laid out very succinctly the ways in which this is just intellectually dishonest and malpractice of a legislative variety. So go Tom Massey. All right, without further ado, I'm moving on to a rare sighting in the wild, which was Kamala Harris gave an interview last week to the noteworthy investigative reporter, Oprah Winfrey. Nick, you did your homework. What did we learn during this interview?
We learned that Tracy Ellis Ross, an actress, Julia Roberts, an actress, Ben Stiller, Chris Rock, Meryl Streep, who Kamala called Marilyn, when she was talking to her via Zoom, all are voting for Kamala Harris because they believe in joy and love and whatever Kamala stands for. This was an in-depth interview. I mean, she talked to, or not an interview, but a kind of public forum with Oprah. Kamala talked for an hour, managed not to say anything really substantive, which was pretty stunning. And in probably tonally the worst bit, there was a moment where they brought a survivor of a recent school shooting, and Kamala very quickly, like they had her talk to her parents a little bit, came back to Oprah and Kamala, where Kamala said, well, I own a gun. And Oprah was like, oh, you own a gun. When you said that at the convention or whatever, like, wow, I didn't know that about you. And she's like, if you come, Kamala was saying, like, if you break into my house, you're getting shot. And then it's like they remembered that they have a school shooting victim, literally a couple of feet away from them. And we're like, this is really tragic and we need to fix this. It's just kind of staggering. The best thing for Donald Trump would be to let Kamala talk more. I don't know how he can do it and obviously every time he opens his mouth, the whole country loses a few IQ points. She is back at it and terrible. And I'll just pinpoint, she was asked a question by one of the people in the audience, what are you going to do about the immigration? And she spent all of her time attacking Donald Trump for sinking the bipartisan border security bill. And then she just said, I'm a prosecutor. I'm going to fix the border. She did not talk about immigration writ large. She did not offer any clear understanding of how she was going to do that. And she stumbled over the fact, as you'll recall, that she was the border czar. She was starting to say, I have a lot of experience with this. And then she kind of had to pull herself up short because if she admitted she was the border czar, she would have to admit that she's done kind of a shitty job. So that's what I learned from all of this. And also that we are living in an era of joy, that she will bring much joy to America.
I feel it in your voice, honestly.
Yep.
Liz, you've just prepared a magazine feature, from what I understand, about kind of the substance of her flip-floppery. Given that she really hasn't had many interviews, it's kind of astonishing how little she's been asked about this. What did you conclude in your look at how she has changed her positions and what that maybe tells her, updates your initial legendary piece from 2019 called Kamala Harris is a cop who wants to be president?
So yeah, she's been, flip-flopping as always. That's kind of her thing. She's been flip-flopping a lot since she started her presidential campaign this past summer. Plot twist, she's been flip-flopping toward freedom. Partially is what we, what I argue in this piece. She's actually sort of walked back a lot of the positions she took in 2020 or in 2019 when she first was running for president back then, because back then she was sort of really trying to appear to be sort of an ultra progressive, to sort of peel off maybe Bernie Sanders voters. So she went for a lot of like very extremely liberal, extremely, social democratic sort of positions. She supported the Green New Deal. She supported Medicare for all. She supported, education, free college for all. She supported a ban on fracking and mandatory buybacks of certain sort of rifles and all of this stuff. And so she's actually, her flip-flops recently have been sort of good in that she's sort of said, never mind, I don't support all of those, terrible policies that I previously supported. But she's also been talking a lot about freedom and how she's all about freedom. And like, some of these things she really is for freedom, but many of them she really isn't. And when she talks about freedom, it's actually sort of, she'll talk about the freedom from gun violence, or freedom to,
unless you break into her house.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, freedom's not free.
Freedom not just to get by, but to thrive. And when you look at what she actually means by freedom in these cases, it means like we're going to put new restrictions on things, or we're going to create big new government policies in the name of protecting sort of your freedom. So it's really this sort of positive freedom values versus, the negative freedom values. And it's really just sort of expanding the concept of freedom to be so broad as to be kind of meaningless, which is kind of something we've seen Republicans trying to do over the years too. And, now they're like, Democrats are like, we want to get on this game of saying we're the party of freedom too. But basically both parties seem to just think like freedom means whatever we want it to mean.
Peter, Axios's Alex Thompson has been doing a pretty tenacious job of revisiting a lot of those 2019 things, bouncing those positions off the campaign right now and saying, do you still believe this? Do you not? And they answer sometimes, and she never does, but the campaign does. And then they don't answer other times, including on immigration. Alex Thompson and Axios also had a pretty good piece from 4 days ago, just laying out the unprecedented nature of how little she has been open to scrutinizing from journalists of any type at all, even compared to Joe Biden when he was in the COVID cocoon in 2020. I saw, I think over the weekend, Tom Nichols, national security guy, Radio Free Tom, tweet something to the effect of like, hey, all these people who are saying, demanding, these pretend undecided voters demanding Kamala Harris to have interviews, they just want her to, fail. They just want to weaponize it so that she hurts. So, like, what's the point? Can you maybe explain to
He's the author of The Death of Expertise.
Yeah, he sure is.
Tom Nichols.
Yeah, can you
the
offer
last thing you want to hear from your president is what they think?
To someone who might have some empathy or like nod a little bit along with that, why some of us non-decided voters, or some of us independents, or some of us journalists might have an interest in Kamala Harris answering questions about her record?
The Kamala Harris campaign apparatus has made a bet that that the best way to convince people to vote for Kamala Harris is not to talk about what Kamala Harris would actually do as president, not to answer any questions about who she really is or what she really believes, because the thing they want you to focus on is she's for joy and the alternative is Donald Trump. The alternative,
Yeah.
right? She's for joy, she's for freedom, and the alternative is Donald Trump, and that's it. That's their whole case. Like, there's a bunch of other words that get associated with this. There's some exaggerated facial reactions and laughing, and this occasional asides about I don't know. What's the fruit? The coconuts, right? There's some coconut stuff.
She's
that goes
kept the coconuts on the wrap.
Mostly
Coconuts. Sure.
All right,
yeah,
but mostly
coconuts are out.
I'm sorry, coconuts are out. Correction.
I think
appendage.
Tangelo is going to be the next big thing.
No pina coladas for the Harris campaign. All right, I get, but this is their bet. Is the only thing that matters is we're positive, we're happy, we talk about freedom and whatever, and the alternative is Donald Trump. And there's for many voters, I think that will be a compelling case. I even get that because Donald Trump is a uniquely enraging candidate. But this is terrible for the republic. This is terrible for democracy. The whole point of democracy is that you have some sort of information. You are voting for something that you you have done some research yourself. You've looked at the candidates and you've made a decision based on what they would do, based on their her campaign is like, no, we're just not going to tell you because we believe that fundamentally it doesn't matter and it might even hurt our campaign if we did tell you.
Yeah, I was communicating with someone on her campaign staff for a little bit, and I tried to pin them down on if she still agreed with some of her 2019 criminal justice policies, because there actually was some good stuff in there, talking about, descheduling marijuana and expunging convictions and ending solitary confinement and abolishing the death penalty and all of this stuff. And just once I tried to pin down specifics and not just talk about the general freedom thing, it just went cold. I didn't hear back from the campaign after that. So,
the one thing that she has going for her relative to Donald Trump, and this is something I think free market conservatives and libertarians really need to grapple with, is the tax foundation, which, is generally seen as leaning to the right, has scored their various tax and spend plans, such as they are, because while it's true that Harris has been kind of vague about stuff, so has Trump to a certain degree. But the way they scored the most recent policies, Trump would add, something like $1.3 trillion in debt. Harris would save some because Trump is promising to cut taxes on all types of stuff and to extend all of the tax cuts that end the tax policy that ends in 2025. He's going to massively reduce revenue. She would raise it up a little bit, which is not necessarily a good thing. But if you care about the debt, it does. They scored Trump's plan as depressing GDP by 0.2% over the next decade. Hers would be 2%, which is gigantic. He would increase wages by 0.5%. She would bring them down. He would cost fewer jobs, but they're both in negative numbers. Trump's policy, and I'm wearing a free Ross Day One t-shirt that I got at PubKey, a Bitcoin themed bar that had an event where Trump came and made a Bitcoin transaction and kind of shilled for his kids' shitcoin platform, World Liberty Financial. And I asked him a question. You signed legislation adding $7.8 trillion to the deficit in your first term. Why would it be different the second time? And he said, we had a little thing called COVID, which is a good zingy rejoinder. But more than half of the legislation he signed increasing the debt came before COVID. It had nothing to do with the pandemic. So on the one hand, you have Harris, who would not probably be as bad on the debt as Trump would be. We know that. So things are blurry now because we are in an era where both of these candidates are truly uninspiring at best and awful at worst.
Sounds like Nick Gillespie prefers tax and spend to tax cut and spend.
No, what I want, thank you, Matt. I'm sorry. I was not listening to you as is my normal default
exactly
setting.
right.
But yeah, no, it is. I mean, we need somebody who is going to cut spending, right?
Yeah.
Just
good luck.
taxed
Good luck
enough
with that.
already, Matt.
I mean, Nick's point just is worth highlighting a little bit because part of the reason that Harris can get away with being so vague, with refusing to answer these questions, with flip-flopping so much to the extent that she has policies, they're not very fleshed out and often quite contradictory with things that she was saying 5 years ago, and those contradictions are unexplained. And the reason she can get away with it, or a reason she can get away with it, is because she's running against Donald Trump, who is not just somebody who enrages people because of the way he is, but also somebody who just blurts out policy ideas seemingly at random that are not considered, that do not make a whole lot of sense. The reason that both Harris and Trump, that Harris is backing not taxing tips, is because Trump just blurted it out like on a golf cart in June, and now this is both parties are for not taxing tips. Trump is now, I guess, also for not taxing overtime or something like that, which definitely no consultant ever anywhere is going to like figure out how to make everybody work 80-hour every other week work weeks, right? So that everything is overweight. Like he doesn't think about any of this stuff. You don't know if it's actually going to go into effect if he becomes president. It's very hard to figure out what he would do. And that puts less pressure on Kamala Harris to explain herself.
He called for on Friday last week, he called for a freeze at like 10% on credit card interest rates. Or something. So it's like,
we've complained about Kamala Harris's price controls on this podcast quite a bit. We should complain. That is price controls, guys.
Yeah.
That is absolutely a price control. And Donald Trump is just out there saying that like huge amounts of the economy should be subject to something that is an implicit price control.
This, where there might be wisdom in this election, to bring it back to everybody's favorite black Nazi in North Carolina, the Democrats are going to win the governorship, but they haven't had the legislature in a while. And it's like, going back at least to Bill Clinton and to some degree Obama, there have been decent outcomes when a Democrat is president and the Republicans control all or part of Congress. But what has changed over time is that the Republicans don't even pretend to give a shit about spending. And Peter, when you were talking about spending bills and stuff like that, 1997 was the last time that Congress actually signed all of the legislation for a fiscal year before that fiscal year started. And that's like the one time in like a million years, pretty much. But it would be great to have that kind of setup again, but I don't know that there's any way to engineer it through, strategic voting.
And it's worth noting that in the 90s, as they were the last time they were passing bills on the schedule, that is also the point where we had the smallest federal spending as a percentage of GDP, and also the last time that deficits weren't a real and serious problem.
Dream of the 90s. It's alive. The Reason Roundtable podcast. All right, let's go to our end of podcast, what we've been consuming in the cultural arena. Peter Suderman, why don't you lead us off?
I watched the George Clooney, Brad Pitt fixer movie Wolves. This is coming out on Apple TV Plus on Friday, but it is in theaters in limited release right now. It's about two guys who specialize in doing sort of criminal cleanup in New York, and they both think that they're the only one who can do what they do, and then they of course end up working on the same job of getting rid of what they believe to be a dead body out of a very expensive hotel room together. And it is an interesting movie in that it is extremely competent. It's really nicely crafted. It's often quite beautiful, and Brad Pitt and George Clooney have real star charisma. But tonally, it simply does not work because this movie is shot and it's designed to look and feel like this very quiet and cold, sort of Michael Clayton-y, almost, Bourne-ish thriller, right? Just sort of dark and grim. And then Clooney and Pitt and the script all seem to think they're in some sort of Coen Brothers-esque, like kind of screwball comedy, and they're doing all of this sort of winky comic, like goofy back and forth, a little bit like Ocean's 11. And it's not funny enough, and it's also not dark and grim enough. And the fact that these things are in tension is never really dealt with. And it just like there's bits that work, and everything sort of works on its everything works on its own and nothing works together. So sadly, I cannot recommend Wolves unless you really just need like a George Clooney, Brad Pitt fix and feel like you got to be a completionist. It'll be on Apple TV Plus, so it won't cost you too much if that's how you want to watch it. But unfortunately, I just didn't think this movie worked.
Nick, what did you consume?
Now I want to talk about how Clooney and Brad Pitt are the Paul Newman, and Steve McQueen are Paul Newman, and Robert Redford are the current moment, Matt. And I want to ask you, right. Did you see Towering Inferno in the theater?
I don't think in the theater. I was a little bit too young to get through in the theater, but I saw it on TV.
Because that, Peter, as you were talking about that, there is hilarious snappy patter at the end of the Towering Inferno where people are like flaming corpses are still falling out of the battle in the background, and Paul Newman, who is the architect, Steve McQueen, who's the fire chief, and they're like, when are you going to build these things with, good fire codes? And it's like, when are you going to show up on time when there's a fire? And it is just great. And it sounds like that's what is being channeled in the movie that you just saw.
I now want them to remake Towering Inferno with Brad Pitt and George Clooney.
That would be so good. I read, speaking of the dead, I read The Genetic Book of the Dead, A Darwinian Reverie by Richard Dawkins, the eminent evolutionary biologist as well as atheist, whom I interviewed in Milwaukee he has a Final Bow tour, which is making its way around the country. People like Camille Foster, Matt's colleague at the Fifth Column, interviewed him in Newark. I got Milwaukee. I guess Richard Dawkins is only going to Rust Belt cities or, I don't know, coming soon to Hartford. But the Genetic Book of the Dead is
his own personal industrial policy.
That's right. He's 83. He is very spry. He has said this is his last tour. Go to richarddawkinstour.com to get information. He's going all over the place. He's going to be on the West Coast and elsewhere, and then in England for a long time. But the Genetic Book of the Dead is a really fascinating kind of mirror of probably his best known book, The Selfish Gene, from 1976. And if The Selfish Gene, which blew apart a lot of the ways that the general public understood evolution as a thing that built towards complexity with humans being at the peak of evolution, et cetera, he exploded that and kind of demonstrated and made real the idea of evolution is that genes are just propagating themselves, and they're doing it all over the place in all kinds of circumstances, and that they are selfish and opportunistic. They just want to replicate themselves, and they trick organisms like humans into doing their bidding, and sometimes even thinking they're in charge of things. The Genetic Book of the Dead is, it represents a deeper, fuller reading of that with, 40 plus years of evolutionary research being tacked into it about how everything is designed through evolution, and that it's a mix of the predispositions that are in genes that act in unpredictable ways in particular environmental moments and niches and things like that. But the big shift is actually he moves from competition to cooperation within a genetic and evolutionary kind of mindset and framework. And it's really a fascinating book. He's an immensely interesting character. And those twin kind of magisteria of evolutionary science and atheism, he's had a major and profound impact on society in our lifetimes. And I highly recommend The Genetic Book of the Dead if you have any interest at all in understanding where evolutionary thinking is and how it kind of creates the world around us in ways that are oftentimes very surprising.
Très good. Liz, what of interest have you consumed?
I'm just going to go with something fluffy here. I've been watching Only Murders in the Building, which is a show on Hulu starring Steve Martin and Martin Short and Selena Gomez, and currently sometimes featuring apparently Kamala Harris superfan Marilyn Streep. It's a murder mystery. It's in its 4th season. It's just fun. It's like impeccably like stage or like art directed. Like it's got like a Wes Anderson feel, not like the same vibe as him, but like the vibe where like everything is set up to sort of evoke this certain sort of world. So it's a very visually compelling show. And it's just like, they're trying to solve a murder each season, and they make a podcast about it. And it's just fun. It's engaging. It doesn't make you think too much, but it's enjoyable. And if you need something to like escape to and not make you think, which is exactly what I'm looking for in TV right now, then I recommend it.
Wait, is there something coming up like in the news that is maybe like weighing on you that you're, I don't know, is there a...
No, nothing.
Oh,
yeah. So I continued my march through the institutions of American history documentaries. And stumbled upon the 2011 PBS documentary on the War of 1812. And
that's my dad's favorite war.
Your dad is correct. I want to party with him.
It's not really over either, right?
It's not. I'd never forget. Tippecanoe. I'm still not over it. It is a documentary that is the advertisement of why you would rather watch a Ken Burns documentary than when he's not doing a PBS documentary. Like the production values are super cheesy, like the sort of historical reenactments with the muskets and the kind of the fuzzy edges of the screen to make you know that this isn't real. It's not great, Bob, those types of things, but it's still a perfectly serviceable documentary of war I didn't know much about or I forgot much of because I'm old, and just utterly pointless, occasionally absolutely savage, like bad American on Canadian and Canadian on American torch village violence around Niagara, just brutal. And like everybody left basically the same as they went in, except for the Indians who got totally screwed in the big surprise reveal. And like the most famous battle happened after the armistice had been signed, but like the technology was so bad they had no idea that the treaty had been already signed.
You're giving Andrew Jackson a pass on that, Matt Welch.
Perhaps. What I want to do really is to have anyone suggest to me any other documentary on this, because it is super interesting. It's particularly interesting in the way that it was more instrumental in the creation of myth than it was necessarily with usable history or changing things. I mean, I think with the notable exception of the Native American tribes who, again, got screwed, and this has really led to some of the worst stuff that happened later on in the 19th century. But as far as the Brits and the Canadians and the Americans were concerned, they all got usable myths. Well, the Brits didn't, but the Canadians certainly did, and Andrew Jackson did, and everybody else, William Henry Harrison did. And it's kind of BS, the myths that are associated with it. So that's a weird way of looking at history that's very common to California histories. The Ken Starr series about California history are all about the dream. And so the dream of the place is different. Like it becomes its own reality that is part of the manufacture of the state, which is in a really kind of interesting way. And I think it's like that. So if anyone has a good documentary, like a super good documentary, or even a fiction, he holds his nose and says, please email them to me because I'm interested in it.
You know, it's fascinating, Matt, that you talk about how that helped create America as a myth, but we don't really reference the War of 1812. I mean, the Star Spangled Banner came out of it, of course, but the people who went through that went back to different wars to kind of create what it was to be American, because we kind of lost that one.
Yeah. I mean, Washington got burned. Sort of sucked.
I mean, so in a way, it's kind of a victory, but I would recommend anybody going to Niagara Falls in Canada. First, go to Niagara Falls, New York, and check out the Love Canal neighborhood, which is back up and running and all of that. But just north of the main downtown, or uptown from the main tourist traps in Niagara Falls, is the Battle of Lundy's Lane. Which was a pivotal battle. And you will see a kind of Canadian warmongering that is mostly absent from contemporary Canuck discourse.
It made their own national mythos because it's basically the only battle of that war in which it was Canadians who were doing all the fighting as opposed to the goddamn redcoats. Okay, that's all of the Brit bashing we have time for on this podcast. Thank you for listening to it. All of our podcasts are available at reason.com/podcasts, including Why We Can't Have Nice Things, the limited run podcast series about the hidden ways the government makes you poorer and sicker. On this week's episode, Eric Boehm tackles why are thousands of donated kidneys and other organs never making it to recipients in need of them? Because a system of monopolistic government contractors is failing at its one and only job. That episode will come on Thursday. Don't want to miss it and see all the other stuff that we've had on that one as well. Nick Gillespie, are there any events I can think of one. We're doing a live roundtable on November 4th at the Village Underground in New York City, one of the great clubs run by the fantastic Noam Dworman, who Nick has recently interviewed and has been interviewed by Nick, whatever, and such. But you go to reason.com/events and click on the thing if there's still tickets available, because we put them on sale last week and they've been flying off. So check that out. Any other events, Nick, that you want to talk?
Yeah, we've got a Reason Speakeasy, which is a live unscripted conversation that doubles as a taping of the Reason interview in October as well, with Musa Al-Gharbi, who's a sociologist at SUNY Stony Brook, or I guess it's called College of Stony Brook, University of Stony Brook now. The SUNY schools are going through an unsuccessful rebranding as not State University of New York, and I say that as a graduate of SUNY Buffalo, which is now University of Buffalo. In any case, go to reason.com/events. Musa Al-Gharbi is a fascinating commentator on what he calls the cultural contradictions of a new elite. And his book, which is out, is called We Have Never Been Woke, is about the way in which mostly white liberals have started to, they are the main agent through which the progressive left shifted far, far to the left, even further left than the minority groups that they claim to represent and try to help. It's a fantastic book. It's going to be a great event. Go to reason.com/events and buy tickets for that, as well as to the live roundtable, if there are tickets available. That's the ticket sales are racking up like sex trafficking charges on rap moguls. Matt Welch.
Very good. Muchos gracias to Elizabeth Nolan Brown, and we shall catch you again next week.
Thanks for having me.